Hello, I'm Maruk Said, your microbiology guide. Let's explore in-depth micro techniques and uncover groundbreaking insight together on this educational journey into the fascinating realms of microbes.
Study designs and epidemiology. Differences between observational and experimental designs. Table of contents. Introduction. Study designs in epidemiology. Observational study design. Descriptive studies. Ecological studies. Cross-sectional studies. Case control studies. Cohort studies. Experimental/interventional study design. Randomized controlled trials. Quasi-experimental study. Introduction. Epidemiology, with its wide-ranging objectives, scope, and applications in clinical research, medicine, and public health, examines the incidence and prevalence of health outcomes and events to prevent or control related issues. It identifies links between various risk factors and health events, measuring the frequency and strength of these associations to understand the causation and patterns of disease spread. The process of an epidemiological study begins with defining and formulating a hypothesis based on the research question. Whether investigating if a specific risk factor or agent contributes to a severe disease, or if healthcare interventions increase the likelihood of a positive outcome, these factors are essential to shaping the research question. The next step involves selecting an appropriate study design to test the hypothesis, which guides the investigative process. While researchers may observe or intervene to some degree, they cannot manipulate associations in a purely experimental manner. Epidemiological study designs, depending on the approach used to explore the relationship between exposure and outcome, are generally classified into two categories: observational study designs, interventional study designs. If you have watched till here, don't forget to subscribe to Family of Science Lovers. Press the bell icon button so you are always updated. Study designs in epidemiology. In an interventional or experimental study design, participants are subjected to interventions by the investigators and assigned to control groups with different exposure conditions. This allows researchers to examine the effects, causal links, and associations between the outcome and the intervention. When experimental study designs are not feasible, observational studies are typically used instead. Observational studies, also known as non-experimental studies, involve observing participants in an uncontrolled environment without making active changes or interventions in any part of the study. Depending on the type of observational study, the approach may be current, retrospective, or prospective. Outlined below are various types of both observational and interventional study designs. Observational study design. Observational study designs are primarily used to examine associations between causes, exposures, and harmful effects. For instance, an investigator cannot ethically intervene by asking a group of smokers to quit smoking while instructing an unexposed group to start smoking in order to study lung cancer patterns. Observational studies do not influence or assign exposure choices among participants, but instead evaluate outcomes among individuals who are either exposed or unexposed to specific factors. However, a notable limitation of observational studies is the potential for inherent differences between the groups studied. For example, populations in different occupations may be exposed to unique occupational hazards and may also vary in lifestyle, health status, and other characteristics. Due to these often immeasurable variables, it can be more challenging to isolate the effect of a particular exposure. Descriptive studies. Descriptive studies focus on detailing the characteristics of a health issue and its prevalence within a population at a specific point in time. In these studies, exposure and outcome are recorded simultaneously without follow-up, meaning causal relationships cannot be established. However, researchers aim to ensure that conclusions drawn from the results are valid. In fields like epidemiology, public health, and social sciences, descriptive studies are commonly employed to generate hypotheses. This study type is further classified based on the unit of study, either as individual-based, such as prevalence and case studies, or population-based, such as ecological studies. Ecological studies. In public health research, ecological studies are used when the unit of analysis is a group and only population-level data is available. In these studies, both the exposure and health outcomes must be apparent within the groups under examination, allowing researchers to measure correlations between exposure and disease rates. Ecological studies are particularly valuable when investigating the impact of exposures on disease conditions requires broad, population-level comparisons. However, ecological fallacy, a type of confounding, can occur when relationships observed at the group level are assumed to apply to individuals within those groups. Ecological study designs are commonly applied in research comparing geographical areas, examining social classes, studying migrant populations, and analyzing disease trends over time. Cross-sectional studies. Cross-sectional studies are widely used due to their relatively straightforward approach. This design focuses on analyzing a segment of the total population, assuming similar characteristics across the group. As an observational study type, it captures both exposure and health outcomes at a single point in time, cross-sectionally, identifying the status of exposure and outcomes simultaneously without establishing causation, a recognized limitation. Surveys are a prominent example of cross-sectional studies, often collecting data on various characteristics at once to explore associations based on well-defined hypotheses. Cross-sectional studies are especially useful for describing the prevalence of outcomes in populations and are widely applied in genetic epidemiology. Case control studies. Case control studies are comparative investigations involving a group with a disease, cases, and a group without the disease, controls. This retrospective study design is particularly useful for examining exposures linked to diseases with longer latency periods. Cases are often asked to recall past exposures, but they may overestimate these compared to controls, leading to a potential limitation known as recall bias. Additionally, careful selection of control groups is crucial to avoid selection bias, as inappropriate controls can affect study outcomes. As a retrospective approach, case control studies are useful for assessing disease prevalence, but are not suitable for measuring incidence. Cohort studies. Cohort studies, also known as longitudinal studies, are observational epidemiological studies that follow the development of disease over time in exposed and unexposed groups. These groups are categorized based on their exposure level, and unlike case control studies that focus on disease prevalence, cohort studies directly measure disease incidence. Multiple outcomes are recorded concurrently, reducing the likelihood of recall bias. However, there is a higher risk of selection bias. Studying rare diseases with this design can be time-intensive and costly, a key disadvantage. Relative risk, a measure of association, is uniquely calculated in cohort studies as it reflects the difference in risk between exposed and unexposed groups. Cohort studies may either follow participants from the point of exposure to outcome or vice versa, and are classified as prospective or retrospective based on this approach. Prospective cohort studies. In a prospective cohort study, a population initially without the disease is divided based on the presence or absence of a specific risk factor. The researcher then follows these groups over time to observe whether they develop the outcome of interest. Retrospective cohort studies. In a retrospective cohort study, participants are categorized based on their past exposure to a specific risk factor. Unlike prospective studies, both the exposure and outcome have already occurred by the time the study begins. Experimental/interventional study design. In interventional study designs, researchers use randomization to assign participants to various conditions, allowing them to control for bias and ensure the groups are comparable from the start. Randomized assignments increase the validity of the study by minimizing the likelihood that observed differences between groups are due to factors other than the intervention being tested. Randomization is a key component of experimental design, essential for drawing reliable conclusions from research. Randomized controlled trials. Randomized controlled trials, often referred to as RCTs, are regarded as the gold standard in epidemiological study designs. This design is based on the principle of randomly assigning participants to distinct groups, typically an experimental group and a control group, to prevent confounding and reduce selection bias. The random allocation ensures that both groups are similar at the study's start. In RCTs, the experimental group receives the treatment or exposure under investigation, while the control group receives either no treatment or a placebo, depending on the study's objective. This setup isolates the impact of the intervention, as it is the only difference between the groups, allowing for a clear assessment of causality. Although RCTs are highly credible and valid for establishing causal relationships, they are often challenging to implement due to ethical considerations, the need for large sample sizes, and the practical difficulties of randomizing participants and settings. Quasi-experimental study, also called non-randomized or pre-post intervention studies in medical informatics literature. Quasi-experimental studies sit between fully controlled RCTs and observational studies. This design is used to explore cause-effect relationships and test hypotheses without randomization. In quasi-experimental studies, researchers aim to assess the intervention's impact on an outcome while still accommodating practical and ethical constraints. Two primary types exist: quasi-experimental designs with a control group and those without a control group, where outcomes are measured before and after the intervention. While not as rigorous as RCTs, quasi-experimental studies still seek to enhance validity and draw meaningful conclusions, especially where randomization is impractical. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, press the bell icon button. Thank you!